The Texas wind has always had something ominous about it. He slithered across the desert plains like a ghost, seeping through every crack, sending chills through his skin. I felt it the first time I set foot on the ground in this godforsaken town whose name gave me a vague sense of unease, Lone Pines. It was one of those places where time stood still, where empty streets and abandoned buildings stood like mute witnesses of past horrors. I did not come here by chance. My job is to investigate the paranormal, although most people just call me a ghost hunter. But I wasn't looking for a ghost here. I received a letter from a local resident, Mr. Bloomfield, who wrote about people disappearing and strange noises at night. He spoke of dark figures appearing under streetlights as the city plunged into darkness. When I got out of the car, the sun was already setting below the horizon, painting the sky in a fiery red color. The shadows lengthened, and the city began to breathe another life. This feeling was as if something unknown was creeping up on me with every step. I started for the house where Mr. Bloomfield was waiting for me. His house stood on the edge of the city, alone among dry trees. Driving up to it, I noticed how the shadows began to move. They slid along the walls, dissolved and reappeared as if trying to get out of control. When I knocked on the door, it was answered by a middle-aged man with deep lines and dark circles under his eyes. His eyes seemed to see more than he was willing to say. "You should know," he whispered as if he were afraid he might be overheard. "There's something wrong here. All these disappearances, they didn't start by accident. Every night I hear footsteps. Quiet at first, then they approach. But when I go outside there is no one there." I knew the night ahead would be long. But what awaited me at Lone Pines surpassed all my worst fears. Something dark and ancient was creeping up on us from the deep recesses of the night. And it had no intention of stopping. Mr. Bloomfield led me into a drawing room paneled with dark wood, where the soft light of an old lamp scarcely dispelled the shadows in the corners. I sat down in an old chair that was cracked under the weight of years and looked around the room. On the walls hung black and white photographs of people whose faces seemed familiar to me, even though I had never seen them before. There was something strange about every shot, as if the shadows in the background were too thick, too present. "Is this a photo of locals?" I asked, nodding at the image. "Yes," answered Bloomfield, "they are all residents of our city. Or were them. Most of them have disappeared. No one knows where they went. Police say it could be a hit and run or accidents. But I know better. There's something hunting us here in Lone Pines." His voice trailed off as he spoke the last words, as if he feared that the mere sound of his words might attract unwanted attention. I was a skeptic even after years of research and encounters with what most people would call the supernatural. But there was such genuine anxiety in Mr. Bloomfield's eyes that even I felt a chill run down my spine. "You said you heard footsteps?" I asked, trying to figure out if it could just be a joke or a manifestation of his own fear. "Every night," he nodded. "They start around midnight. At first it seems like it's just the wind or an animal, but each time they get louder. They come closer, but as soon as I step out onto the porch, everything disappears. It cannot be an ordinary animal or person." I decided to stay at Bloomfield's house for the night to find out what was going on. We agreed that I would be in the guest room and he would be in his own study. Night came and the whole city was plunged into silence, which became more and more tense with each hour. At midnight, when the whole house was shrouded in darkness, I heard them. At first it was a slight rustling as if someone had stealthily walked across the floor. Then the sound grew louder, turning into distinct footsteps. They were walking from the corridor. My heart was pounding in my chest. I carefully got out of bed and approached the door, leaning my ear against the wooden surface. The footsteps continued to approach. It felt like someone invisible was trying to get to my room. I carefully opened the door and looked out into the corridor. It was empty. But the footsteps still echoed as if someone had just passed me by without leaving a trace. My instincts told me that I was involved in something much deeper than simple paranormal phenomena. At that moment I realized that this was only the beginning. Fear filled the body, but curiosity and the desire to know the truth were stronger. I knew that the following night could be decisive in my investigation. Well, Texas has always been known for its dark secrets. And I think I just discovered one of them. The night passed without sleep. Every sound seemed suspicious, every gust of wind a harbinger of something bigger. It was almost graying in the morning when I finally felt I could relax for a moment. However, even this brief moment of peace was shattered by an unexpected knock on the door. Mr. Bloomfield was standing in the doorway. His face was even more wasted than in the evening. He looked like he'd been staring at something only he could see all night. "You heard that too, right?" he asked quietly, as if he was afraid to say the words out loud. "Yes," I answered, trying to hide the anxiety that was swarming in my mind. "But I didn't see anyone." Every time I opened the door, the hallway was empty. "It's always like that," he said, lowering his eyes. "These steps, they seem to be pulling me somewhere, to some other place. Wherever they appear, they always disappear without a trace. And no one can explain what it means." I knew that simply ignoring it was not an option. Too many unclear details, too many mysteries. I decided it was time to explore the city. Mr. Bloomfield suggested starting where he said he heard those footsteps most often, an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of Lone Pines. According to him, this house was the place where one of the first disappearances in the city took place. We went there together. The house stood alone in the middle of a grassy clearing. Its walls were covered with cobwebs, the windows had broken long ago, and the door was barely hanging on its hinges. The place looked as if it had been left in a hurry, as if its inhabitants had fled, leaving everything where it was. "There used to be a family here," Bloomfield explained as we approached the door. "All disappeared in one night. Police found no signs of a struggle. They just disappeared." We went inside, and the smell of dampness and rot immediately hit our nose. The house was full of silence that seemed to press into the floor. I felt something strange, as if the air had become thicker, as if the place itself was saturated with an invisible presence. We looked around several rooms, and in each one I saw the same thing. Abandoned furniture, neglected things that reminded me of the life that had once been here. But in one of the rooms we found something that made my heart skip a beat. There were footprints on the dusty floor, right in the middle of the room. They looked completely fresh, as if someone had passed through just a few minutes ago. But the worst thing was that the tracks started right in the middle of the room and disappeared near the wall, which had no way out. No doors, no windows, just a bare wall. It's impossible," Bloomfield whispered, surveying the tracks. "How could they appear here?" My skin was covered with goosebumps. Everything I saw was against all common sense. But I couldn't deny that it was a reality. The marks were there, and they had no explanation. It was more than just strange noises in the night. There was something extremely sinister going on here in this house, something that could leave traces but didn't have a body. And I began to realize that this was only the beginning of my journey into the darkness that had enveloped Lone Pines. The mark on the dusty floor did not leave my mind. Mr. Bloomfield and I stood in that ominous room, and I could not shake the feeling that something was watching us. It was almost a physical sensation, as if the air had become thick and heavy, saturated with an invisible presence that never left us. "What's next?" Bloomfield asked, trying to hide his anxiety. His voice sounded too loud in this eerie silence. "We need to explore the city," I replied, looking away from the footprints on the floor. "Maybe we will find something that connects these disappearances." "Did you say this is just the beginning? What else happened here?" Bloomfield nodded and walked slowly to the window, behind which the morning sun shone dimly. His hands nervously gripped the windowsill, and his eyes were fixed on something he must have only seen in his memories. After the disappearance of the family, others started in this house. First, children disappeared from the streets, then adults. The police came, inspected the scene, but found nothing. No clues, no clues. The city became like a ghost. People no longer went outside after dark, fearing it would be their last walk. Were there any suspicions? I asked, trying to piece together the puzzle of this horrific scenario. Maybe someone in the city caused concern? Were there any strange people? Bloomfield turned to me, his face full of doubt. "There is one man," he began hesitantly, "but I'm not sure he has anything to do with it. His name is Lester Wood. He lives alone on the edge of town and has always been watched with suspicion. But he is not like everyone else. His behavior was always unusual." "What exactly makes him suspicious?" I frowned, trying to catch every detail. "Lester was always aloof," Bloomfield explained. "He rarely spoke to others, and when he appeared in the city, people felt anxious. There are rumors that he knows more about these disappearances than he is letting on. But no one dared to ask him directly. I decided the next step would be to visit Lester Wood. If this man really does know more, then he could be the key to unlocking this mystery. We left the old house and went to Lester's house. The road stretched through a desert area, where withered trees and yellow grass created a picture of neglect. Wood's house stood alone in this landscape, remote from the city, as if it had deliberately isolated itself from the rest of the world. When we drove up, I immediately felt a chill on my skin. The house looked as if it had not known human hands for a long time. The windows were covered with black curtains and there was no sign of life. I went to the door and knocked. The answer was silence, so thick that it seemed as if the house absorbed all the sounds around it. He knocked again, and this time he heard a slight rustling inside, as if someone was moving cautiously in the shadows. The door opened a millimeter, and half a face appeared, a grim, unfriendly look that immediately pierced me through. "What do you need?" croaked a husky voice that was undoubtedly Lester Wood's. "My name is Thomas Gray and I'm investigating a disappearance in Lone Pines," I answered, trying to keep my cool. "I would like to talk to you." Wood stared at me in silence, his gaze heavy and distrustful. After a long pause, he finally opened the door a little wider, inviting us in. I felt something invisible enter my insides, as if this very place had some dark power. We stepped inside and the door closed behind us with a faint click. The air smelled of dampness and old age, and the atmosphere was so tense that my every step echoed in the empty rooms. I realized that we are on the threshold of a new chapter in this terrible investigation. And it promised to be much darker than anything we've seen before. Lester Wood's house was more like a gloomy museum. Everything here was frozen in time, as if the outside world had stopped decades ago. Every corner was filled with a sense of oblivion, as if the owner had deliberately preserved this space from any interference. Wood led us into the living room where every piece of furniture was covered in dust. He gestured for us to sit down, although it seemed that even these chairs had not served their purpose for a long time. He lowered himself into the old chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. "So what brought you to me?" Wood asked, not looking directly at us. His gaze wandered around the room as if searching for something that only he could see. "We're looking for information on a disappearance in Lone Pines," I began, trying to sound as soft as possible. "There are rumors that you know more than others." Wood looked at me with curiosity but not much confidence. "People always see what they want to see," he answered mysteriously. "And when something terrible happens, they look for someone who can answer for it. They are afraid to admit to themselves that there are things that are beyond their understanding." "Do you know anything about these disappearances?" I continued, sensing that we were approaching something important. Wood leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He looked tired, as if the weight of all his years had suddenly fallen upon him. "I've seen more than I should," he said quietly. "But what I know may be too much for you." "We need to know the truth," I insisted. "If there is any information that can help, we need to hear it." Wood opened his eyes and looked straight at me. I saw something in his gaze that filled me with cold horror, the sense that he actually held an incredible secret. "Okay," he finally agreed. "But know that after this you will not be able to return to the way it was before." He got up and left the room. A few minutes later he returned with an old, yellowed folder. He placed it on the table in front of us and opened it. Inside were old photographs and notes made in uneven handwriting. "These are records from the time when the city began to sink into darkness," he explained. "Here are all the details you may need. The disappearances did not start by chance. It wasn't just a chain of accidents." I studied the records, looking at photographs of the disappearances, old newspaper clippings, and even a few testimonies from people who had disappeared. One name stood out among all the others. The name of a person who was involved in all this, even if he was never officially linked to these events. "Who is he?" I asked, pointing to the name in the records. Wood looked at me carefully before answering. "This is your next step," he said. "But be careful. You are playing with something that can destroy your life." I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me. Am I really ready for this? But the way back was already closed. Something about this investigation made me want to keep going, even if it meant getting close to something really horrible. As we left Wood's house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just stepped into the abyss that had swallowed up so many people before us. But for some reason I felt that right here, in these old records, lay the key to solving all the horrors that beset Lone Pines. Back at the hotel, I felt the fear becoming more and more real. The city, which seemed to me just quiet and abandoned, now took on an ominous atmosphere that I could not ignore. My hands were shaking as I spread the papers we had received from Lester Wood on the table. The one whose name appeared in the records was well known in town: Lee Harris, the former sheriff of Lone Pines. But why was nothing mentioned about him in official investigations? Something was off, and I felt we were getting closer to the solution, but the price might be too high. Suddenly I heard something fall in the corridor. A loud knock echoed in my heart. I got up and walked out into the dark hallway, only to see shadows moving at the end. I felt the terror wash over me, but I forced myself to go forward. Step by step I approached the end of the corridor, where the shadows seemed to absorb the light. My legs were heavy, and each step was given to me with an incredible effort. Finally I reached the door and found it slightly ajar. Behind the door was a dimly lit room. I opened the door and went inside. What I saw made me freeze in terror. In the middle of the room lay Mr. Bloomfield on the floor, his eyes wide with terror, and a mask of terror frozen over his face. His body was motionless, but his face still had the expression that he had seen something terrible before his death. I felt the cold hands of fear wrap around me. It was a trap. We were just pawns in someone's game, and now I was alone without allies in this creepy city. I knew I couldn't stay here. But even if I escape, will I make it out alive? When I returned to my room, I found that all of Wood's papers and records were gone. They were simply not there, as if they had never existed. I was about to leave when the front door suddenly opened. The same Lee Harris stood at the door. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice even but with an ominous menace in it. I retreated back, but the room was too small to escape. You did it?" I whispered, trying to figure out what was going on. "Are you to blame for everything that happened in Lone Pines?" Harris only smiled, but there was nothing human in his smile. "Some secrets must remain closed," he said, stepping forward. "And you opened them. And now, like everyone else, you must disappear." I didn't have time to react when he rushed at me with incredible speed. The room was filled with the noise of struggle, but I could not resist. His strength was inhuman, and soon my entire body was engulfed in darkness. The last thing I saw before I passed out was the same look I had seen on Mr. Bloomfield's face, a look of utter horror and realization that I was now another victim of this mystical game. When I woke up, I found myself outside the city limits. My body was exhausted, but I was alive. I slowly got up, realizing that I had managed to save myself. Lone Pines is behind me, but this terrible experience is forever etched in my memory. The city swallowed me up like so many others, but I broke free from its embrace. But I knew that Lone Pines and its people would never let me rest again. The secrets I discovered left me with a scar that will never heal.